News Talk is online. News Talk Online is a production of Paltalk.com, the largest multimedia interactive program on the internet with more than 4 million unique users on demand on iTunes and on YouTube and on Blip TV, and my blog, GaryBaumgarten.com, where you're encouraged to post your comments, whether you agree with yours truly or not, no retribution. And thanks to our good friends at CRN Digital Talk Radio, we're syndicated to an additional 12 million households. I am your host, Gary Baumgarten. I welcome you to the show, and I encourage you, as I always do, to go to the Paltalk News Network website, which resides at reportergary.com. That's reportergary.com for stories that you may or may not see, hear, or read in the mainstream media. One story that is in the mainstream media, but is actually being fed quite a bit by the non-traditional media, except for the fact that in Egypt they've shut down the internet, they've shut down mobile phone service, they've shut down text messaging, they've shut down Facebook. They don't want people there organizing over the internet or their mobile phones, but people seem to know exactly where to go and where to be and when to be there, not just in Cairo, but across the land, as the protests mount in Egypt against the Mubarak regime that has been in power for 3 decades now. Today, some very extraordinary things occurred. Yes, there was some heavy-handedness by the authorities, the police. There have been some recent fatalities as a result of the confrontations, especially away from Cairo, as I understand it, because it's out of the eyes of the international press, which is all gathered, of course, in the nation's capital. But something very extraordinary also has been occurring on the other side of the spectrum. Some of the police officers have been taking off their badges, covering up their uniforms, and crossing the street and joining the protesters. What does this mean for Egypt? Is this a sign of democracy in action, or will the Muslim Brotherhood rear its ugly head and sneak into power and create a fundamentalist regime in Egypt, one in which at least those in the West would wish didn't take place? Well, joining us to put it all into perspective is Joshua Stacher, S-T-A-C-H-E-R. He's a poli-sci professor at Kent State University and expert on the Middle East. Professor Stacher, welcome to News Talk Online on the Paltalk News Network.
Hi, thank you very much for having me.
It is our pleasure completely. And could you tell us, Dr. Stacher, what your analysis is of what is going on, the extraordinary events in Egypt specifically, and also we see some protests going on in Jordan. We've had people on in the previous hour from Tunisia telling us about the situation there. It seems like the iron hand of the Middle East governments is not as strong as it was maybe as recently as a month ago.
This is entirely true, and many of us that have spent a long time thinking about the region in very serious and nuanced ways are entirely surprised by the events of the past 2 weeks, meaning the revolution in Tunisia and now that it's being spreading to Cairo and to Egypt. Yes.
What is the story there with who is in control? I think, to me, you anticipate, of course, when you have riot police out, and we know that the Egyptian police are extremely well trained when it comes to putting down demonstrations. They're probably better at that than anything else, unfortunately. And so you're going to find confrontations, and you are going to find times when people might get hurt or worse on either side of that divide. But the fact that there were cops that were taking their uniforms off and joining the people, I found to be extremely telling.
Well, the protests are incredible because if they're really unified under this sort of utter hatred for how people have been treated in Egypt, whether that's economically, whether that's politically, whether it's police brutality and repression, whether you're talking about, somebody that has a job but feels like they're overworked and underpaid. So, and the police forces were no different. The conscripts that served in the riot police, the Central Security Forces, as they're called, and then Markezi in Arabic, they really were not treated well. So it's not all that surprising that once they saw that authority and hierarchy was breaking down, that many of them would jump ship. We can say tonight, or we can say right now, that the police and the riot police are no longer operational in Cairo. That's over. Now what we're talking about is the military on the streets. So Egypt effectively does not have a police force tonight.
So that's an indication, Joshua Stacher from Kent State University, expert on the Middle East, that Mubarak, I mean, this was the last card that he would want to play, because while it shows a strength by bringing out the military, it shows a weakness by bringing out the military politically as well, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. And I think that Mubarak has probably played his hand into a corner. It's going to be very difficult for him to survive this. You know, when you put the military on the street, all that did was invigorate the protesters more, because they knew they had him on the run. But the bottom line is they knew they had him on the run last night when he turned off their internet and shut down their cellular networks.
Right, it was an act
they knew how serious this was.
Right, it was an act perhaps of desperation. Both of these are acts of desperation by the regime.
Absolutely.
So before we get into who fills the void if in fact he topples, which from what you're saying is if not a probability, it's certainly a possibility, I'm really interested in the nuanced way the United States government is approaching all of this. It seems that Hillary Clinton today was kind of showing support for the good deeds that Mubarak did in the past as a friend to the United States, but she really wasn't endorsing him, was she?
No, she was not. And this has been a sort of welcome development where the Secretary of State and the White House Press Secretary, Robert Gibbs, have both kind of come out and said, look, we're not choosing people anymore. We're going to try and stay sort of neutral in this. We want this to kind of work out for the aspirations of the Egyptian people. But there's a couple words that I'm having problems with tonight coming out of Washington. And the one is they don't really say democracy. And so this is going to be a real challenge and a real test for Washington, that if they really believe in all this democracy, they're going to have to let Egyptians choose who runs them. And unfortunately, we've been on the wrong side of that for 3 decades in Egypt and before.
Not just in Egypt, excuse me for interrupting, Joshua Stacher
from
Kent State, but there are other places where we say we favor democracy, except when the people elect folks that we don't favor, and then we don't want to deal with those regimes when that happens. And so either, you know, we're for democracy or we're not. I mean, I am no friend of Hamas by any stretch of the imagination. I agree that Hamas wants to destroy the state of Israel, and I'm a supporter of the state of Israel, but I mean, a group of Palestinians did elect Hamas into office, and if we're in support of democracy, whether we like it or not, aren't we obligated in cases like that to recognize that government? And if a government is duly elected, and of course that remains to be seen, should Hosni Mubarak fall, are we going to recognize a democratically elected government if we disagree with it or not?
Well, this is going to be the real challenge for the United States. I mean, the other real problem that's coming out of the White House tonight is this incestuous talk about, like, the time to reform is now. Like, you must immediately reform. Like, that's too late. It's over. It was over when people took to the street. They weren't pushing for reform on these people long enough. And now they're stuck, as U.S. foreign policy usually is, in a rock and a hard place when it comes to the Middle East. I think that the fall of the Iranian government under the Shah in 1979 offers us a teachable moment here. The Shah was much like Mubarak. He was a staunch U.S. ally. They pumped a lot of money into that military. And when it fell, what you saw was an utter regime collapse. The military left, everybody left, and there was nothing left there, which allowed the sort of clerics to take over. I don't think we're going to see that dynamic in Egypt. when you talk about Egypt, I think that Mubarak has played his hand into a corner, and eventually, regardless of how stubborn this man is, and I can assure you Hosni Mubarak is stubborn, and he does not like being shamed into stepping down, I can guarantee this. But the one thing we can say is that politics has forever changed in Egypt, and if Mubarak is kind of forced to abdicate or leave, then I think that the military will fill that void and will prevent the rise of something like the Muslim Brotherhood, which, by the way, is the most organized political force in the country, from taking over. So,
and they don't believe in the right of women to vote, do they? The Muslim Brotherhoods, they do believe in the right of women to vote.
Absolutely. Yeah, the Muslim Brotherhood, they believe in the power of numbers, and they like elections because they know how to mobilize people, and they would like to have more people empowered because it works in their advantage.
This is Joshua Stacher. Am I pronouncing your last name right, Doctor?
Stacher.
Stacher, okay. Stacher, I apologize. Joshua Stacher, but it's spelled S-T-A-C-H-E-R. He's a Kent State University professor of poli-sci, an expert on the Middle East, an author. He's got a book in the making. Before we go to the numerous people who want to ask you questions, Dr. Stacher, I'd like to ask you about one minority that is quite beleaguered, as we well know, under normal conditions in Egypt, and that's the Coptic Christians. And I'm wondering whether there are forces that are taking advantage of this breakdown in authority to, and I've heard anecdotally that there may be some incidents going on. Have you heard anything about the fate of the Coptic community?
I have not heard anything about the fate of the Coptic community as of yet. I can assure you that the Copts were out with their Muslim brothers out in protest. They're also seething. We just had a terrible a bombing of a church on New Year's Eve by extremist elements, and there's a couple ways you can look at it. This isn't sort of Muslim hatred versus Christians as much as it was the state's inability to manage its sectarian problem. It had not created a framework that you could integrate people. Copts were legally discriminated against underneath the constitution in Egypt. So now what the real opportunity here is for Egyptians themselves, whoever they elect, to craft a document that really plays by the rules of full and equal citizenship. And if you have those strong documents in place, I feel like you'll have much less of a problem of sectarian tensions.
Let's get right to the callers for Dr. Joshua Stacher from Kent State University. Our